At your age, a 30-year loan is statistically optimistic, Mrs. Gable. The bank manager, a smug, 30-something man in a suit that was too tight, smirked as he said it. He was rejecting my loan application for a small community arts center, not based on my perfect credit or my substantial assets, but on my age. He saw a frail, 72-year-old widow, a bad bet. He had no idea that the substantial assets I had at his very bank totaled just over $8 million. And he was about to find out what happens when a bad bet cashes in her chips. This is the story of a man who thought a grandmother was a liability and a grandmother who was about to become his entire bank's biggest problem. If you believe that respect is the only currency that matters, subscribe now and hit the notification bell, because you are about to witness the most satisfying withdrawal in banking history. Part 1. The air in the manager's office at the local branch of Sterling National Bank was stale and smelled faintly of wilting lilies. I sat in a chair that was clearly designed to be slightly lower than his, a subtle power play I had seen in 1,000 boardrooms. In my hands, I clutched a detailed, professional-grade proposal, complete with financial projections and a business plan. It was for a small, non-profit community arts center I wanted to build in our quiet, sun-drenched town of Ojai, a place for children and seniors to learn pottery, painting, and music. It was the dream project of my retirement, a way to give back to the community that had been my home for 40 years. All I needed was a small business loan of $200,000 to get it off the ground, a loan that would be more than secured by my own assets. The branch manager, a man named Mr. Davies with a slick, gelled haircut and a permanently condescending expression, had not even opened the proposal. He had glanced at my date of birth on the application, and his decision had been made. He spent 10 minutes giving me a patronizing lecture on the realities of the market, his voice oozing with a false sympathy that was more insulting than open contempt. He spoke to me as if I were a child asking for a loan to build a lemonade stand. "It's a wonderful idea, a lovely little hobby," he said, pushing my proposal back across the polished expanse of his desk. "But the bank has to consider the long-term viability. The primary guarantors, longevity, is a factor. At your age, a 30-year loan is statistically optimistic, Mrs. Gable." He smiled, clearly pleased with his clever, cruel little phrase. He saw a sweet old lady in a lavender cardigan, a financially naive widow who had probably inherited her money and didn't understand how the real world worked. He saw my gray hair and my wrinkled hands and saw a risk. I felt a familiar, cold fire ignite in my chest. I had faced men like him my entire life. Men who had underestimated me, dismissed me, and tried to put me in a box labeled past her prime. I didn't argue. I didn't protest. I just gave him a small, tight, unreadable smile. "I see," I said, my voice quiet. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Davies. You've been very clear." I stood up, took my proposal, and walked out of his office. He had made a business decision based on a stereotype. I was about to make a business decision of my own, based on cold, hard numbers. His numbers. Will this heartless dismissal lead to a shocking karmic reckoning? This story of a hidden power is just getting started. If you're hooked by this story of karma, subscribe now so you don't miss the next chapter. Part 2. My late husband Arthur and I were not born into the idyllic New Age wealth of Ojai. We were builders. We started a small, specialty construction company in the 1970s, focusing on earthquake retrofitting, a decidedly unglamorous but essential niche in Southern California. Arthur was the brilliant engineer. I was the one with the business brain. I negotiated the contracts, I managed the payroll, I invested our profits. I built our fortune, brick by brick, deal by deal, with a shrewd, conservative financial strategy that had weathered recessions, market crashes, and the dot-com bubble. When we sold the company and retired, we were, to put it mildly, extraordinarily wealthy. But we never lived like it. We valued our privacy and our community. We drove a sensible Volvo. We lived in the same comfortable, but not ostentatious, ranch house we had owned for 30 years. Our money, all of it, was held at this single local branch of Sterling National Bank. It was a decision we had made years ago, a gesture of loyalty to the small community bank that had given us our first business loan. Over the years, that small bank had been swallowed up by a bigger one, and then a bigger one, until it was just another branch of a national chain. But we had stayed. I had $8,247,000 spread across various checking, savings, and investment accounts at Mr. Davies's branch. I was, though he was clearly too incompetent to realize it, his single largest depositor. I was what is known in the banking world as a whale. Mr. Davies was the perfect embodiment of the new, impersonal corporate banking culture. He was a transplant from some generic Orange County suburb, a mid-level manager on a career track, doing his time in a regional branch before moving up the ladder. He didn't know the community. He didn't know its history. He saw his customers as credit scores and sales opportunities. He was incentivized not by customer loyalty, but by his branch's quarterly profit and loss statement. His job was to minimize risk and maximize fees. A 72-year-old woman asking for a loan for a non-profit was, in his spreadsheet-driven world, all risk and no profit. He had no idea that the risk, sitting in front of him, was the very foundation of his branch's financial stability. What is this hidden fortune that could change everything? Part 3. When I got home, I did not stew in anger. I got to work. My first call was not to another bank, but to my wealth manager, a sharp young woman in Los Angeles named Sarah who understood that age was an asset, not a liability. Sarah, I said, I'm restructuring. I want you to prepare for a full liquidation of my accounts at Sterling National. There was a surprised silence on the other end of the line. All of them, Mrs. Gable? That's a significant move. Is there an issue? You could say that, I replied grimly. Their risk assessment and my investment goals are no longer aligned. The conflict was now in motion, a quiet financial avalanche that was about to sweep down the mountain. The primary obstacle was the sheer logistics of moving that much money. It wasn't like taking cash from an ATM. It required coordination, paperwork, and most importantly, it would trigger a series of internal alarms at the bank. I didn't want to just move the money. I wanted to make a statement. I wanted Mr. Davies to feel the full crushing weight of his arrogant miscalculation. Sarah and I devised a plan. It would be a two-pronged attack. First, we would initiate the transfer of the $7 million held in my investment portfolios. This would be handled by her firm, a massive, powerful entity that would deal with Sterling National's corporate headquarters, bypassing the local branch entirely. Mr. Davies would not even see it coming. He would only see the result. The second and more theatrical part of the plan involved the roughly $1.2 million I held in my local checking and savings accounts. That part, I would handle myself. In person. The battle would not be fought in a boardroom in LA. It would be fought across the polished marble counter of his own, soon-to-be decimated branch. Will a secret from the past turn the tables? Part 4. The ticking clock was the bank's own reporting cycle. As Sarah explained, a branch's total deposits are calculated on a weekly basis. A sudden massive withdrawal of this magnitude would be a black hole in Mr. Davies's quarterly report, a career-ending anomaly that would trigger an immediate audit from corporate and send his branch's performance rating into a nosedive. We decided to execute the plan on a Friday, the last day of the banking week, to maximize the immediate impact. A small, satisfying subplot emerged around the community itself. News of my art center project, and the bank's refusal to fund it, had begun to circulate through Ojai's famously tight-knit grapevine. I had mentioned it to my friend Eleanor at our weekly book club, and she was incensed. Eleanor was the matriarch of one of the town's founding families, a woman of immense, quiet influence. She began to make some quiet calls of her own. The complexity of the situation deepened. Mr. Davies's insult was not just to me, but to the community he was supposed to be serving. The ground was shifting under his feet, and he was completely unaware. My personal preparation was meticulous. I spent the week with Sarah, lining up a new home for my funds at a smaller, more community-focused private bank in Santa Barbara. I was not just divesting from Sterling National. I was reinvesting in an institution that shared my values. It was a quiet, principled stand that was the exact opposite of Mr. Davies's short-sighted, profit-driven worldview. The pressure was not on me. I was in a position of absolute power. The pressure was a slow, crushing weight, descending on a man who had no idea he was already financially and reputationally doomed. But will the next event shock everyone? Part 5. Friday morning arrived, bright and clear. The first part of the plan had already been executed. At 9:01 a.m., Sarah's firm had initiated the wire transfer of the $7 million from my investment accounts. Somewhere, in the digital ether of high finance, a massive hole had just been blown in the balance sheet of the Ojai branch of Sterling National. Around 11 o'clock, I put on a simple dress, grabbed my handbag and my checkbook, and drove my sensible Volvo to the bank. The lobby was quiet. There were 2 tellers open and a short line of customers. I did not go to the manager's office. I got in line, like any other customer. When it was my turn, I stepped up to the window of a young, friendly-looking teller. "Good morning," I said with a warm smile. "I'd like to close my accounts, please. All of them. And I'd like the remaining balance in the form of a cashier's check." I slid my debit card and my driver's license across the counter. The teller smiled back and began to type. Her smile faltered. She blinked, looking at her screen. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said, her voice a little shaky. "Can you just confirm the amount for me?" I looked at the number on her screen. "Yes," I said calmly. $1,247,312.42. That looks right. The turning point was the sound of the blood draining from the young woman's face. She looked up at me, her eyes as wide as saucers, and then she looked past me, towards the glass-walled office where her boss was sipping his mid-morning coffee. She knew, with the certainty of a career-ending transaction, that this was not something she could handle. I need to get my manager," she stammered, and fled from her station. A moment later, Mr. Davies came striding out of his office, an annoyed look on his face, clearly irritated at being disturbed. The look of annoyance turned to one of confusion, and then to one of pure, dawning horror as he saw me standing there, and then looked at the numbers glowing on the teller's screen. How will this shocking secret change their lives forever? This incredible twist has you hooked? Subscribe now for more stories of delicious karma. Part 6. "Mrs. Gable," Mr. Davies said, his voice a strangled attempt at professional calm. "There must be some mistake. A withdrawal of this size. We require advance notice." "Oh, I don't think so," I said, my voice still light and pleasant. I pulled the bank's own terms and conditions pamphlet from my handbag. I had it pre-marked. "According to your own rules, for a withdrawal of funds via cashier's check from a private account, no advance notice is required. It just may take a few minutes to process." The immediate consequence was that we now had an audience. The other customers in the bank were watching, sensing a drama far more interesting than their own deposits and withdrawals. Davies's face was turning a blotchy red. He knew I was right. He was legally obligated to give me my money. But he also knew what this meant for his branch. He tried to usher me into his office, to get the humiliation out of the public eye. I politely declined. "No, thank you, I'm quite comfortable here." The repercussions began almost immediately. He had to make a series of frantic whispered phone calls, likely to his regional supervisor, to get authorization for a check of that size. The process took nearly 45 minutes. For 45 agonizing minutes, he was forced to stand there in the lobby of his own bank, a hostage to my quiet, smiling vengeance, while the entire world watched. When the check was finally, grudgingly printed, he brought it over to me himself, his hand trembling slightly. "Is there anything else I can do for you, Mrs. Gable?" he asked, his voice a hollow shell of his former arrogance. "No, thank you, Mr. Davies," I said, taking the check. "You've already done quite enough." I then turned and walked out of the bank, leaving behind me a man whose career had just been professionally and publicly executed. Will they overcome this new challenge? Part 7. The drive to the new bank in Santa Barbara was the most satisfying drive of my life. When I walked in, the president of the bank was waiting for me at the door. He shook my hand. "Welcome, Mrs. Gable," he said with genuine warmth. "We are honored to have your business. We've already spoken to the Ojai Community Foundation. We would be delighted to fund your arts center in full." My growth in this chapter was in the realization that my power was not just financial. It was communal. My vengeance against one man had become an act of creation for my entire town. The challenge was to overcome the anger, which was a powerful but ultimately destructive fuel, and to channel that energy into something positive. My no to Sterling National had become a powerful yes to my own community. My transformation was from a quiet, private philanthropist into an active, visible community leader. I was no longer content to write checks from the sidelines. I threw myself into the Arts Center project, not just as its funder, but as its director. I hired architects, I worked with contractors, my old company in fact. I developed the curriculum. The anger that had fueled my initial decision was gone, replaced by the joyful, exhausting, and deeply fulfilling work of building something new. I was not a retiree with a hobby. I was a founder, an executive, a woman with a mission. But what awaits them in the next confrontation? Part 8. The final confrontation was not with Mr. Davies, who I heard had been unceremoniously transferred to a struggling branch in a strip mall in Bakersfield, the Siberia of California banking. The final confrontation was with the institution that had allowed him to flourish. A week after my withdrawal, I received a call. It was from the senior vice president of Sterling National's entire West Coast division. His name was Robert Sterling, a cruel cosmic irony of a name, and he wanted a meeting. "Mrs. Gable," he'd said, his voice a smooth corporate purr. "It seems we have made a significant error. I would like to fly down to meet with you personally, to see what we can do to win back your business." I agreed to the meeting. It was to be held at my home. I prepared for it not by hiring lawyers, but by baking cookies. And by inviting a few guests. I invited Eleanor, the matriarch of Ojai. I invited the mayor. I invited the head of the local small business association. I was not preparing for a negotiation. I was preparing for an ambush. A very polite, very Californian, very public ambush. The tension was not about getting my money back. It was about what I would demand in its place. The final confrontation will reveal everything, won't it? Part 9. Robert Sterling was exactly what I expected. A tall, handsome man in a perfectly tailored suit, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He arrived at my modest ranch house, clearly expecting a private, one-on-one apology session where he could charm the little old lady and win back her millions. He walked into my living room and stopped dead. It was filled with a small, but formidable group of the most influential people in Ojai. I made the introductions. "Robert," I said with a sweet smile, "I'd like you to meet some of my friends. We were just discussing the vital role of community banking in small towns like ours." The climax was in the slow, horrified realization on his face that this was not a private apology. It was a public hearing. For the next hour, he was forced to sit there, eating one of my homemade oatmeal raisin cookies, while my friends and I, one by one, politely and ruthlessly took his bank apart. Eleanor spoke about how the bank had denied loans to 3 local, family-owned farms. The head of the business association spoke about the outrageous new fees that were crippling small retailers on the main street. The mayor spoke about the bank's refusal to sponsor any community events. I let them make the case. I was the silent judge. When they were finished, I turned to the pale, sweating Mr. Sterling. "So, Robert," I said, my voice still light and friendly, "you wanted to know what you could do to win back my business. But I think the real question is, what are you going to do to win back this town?" My vengeance was complete. It was not a withdrawal. It was a leveraged buyout of his bank's entire community relations strategy. I had him cornered, not with lawyers, but with the undeniable collective power of the community he had ignored. Sterling National Bank, faced with a PR nightmare and the collective flight of an entire town's most influential depositors, caved completely. They did not win back my $8 million. I left that with the community bank that had believed in me. But they did, under duress, make a massive multi-year, 7-figure commitment to the town of Ojai. They established a new small business microloan program. They became the primary sponsor of the Ojai Music Festival, and they funded the creation of a new wing at the local library. The long-term consequence was that a soulless corporate branch was forced, by the quiet, stubborn power of one old woman and her friends, to become a genuine community partner. The emotional resolution for me was the profound joy of seeing my town thrive, of seeing my dream of an art center become a reality, surrounded and supported by the very people I had sought to serve. My anger had become a catalyst for positive, lasting change. I had not just bankrupted a branch. I had reinvested its soul. A year later, at the grand opening of the Gable Community Arts Center, the new branch manager of Sterling National Bank, a bright, empathetic young woman who was born and raised in Ojai, presented me with a final check for our scholarship fund. "On behalf of the bank," she said with a genuine smile, "we are honored to be your partner." I looked out at the crowd of happy children, their hands covered in paint and clay, and I knew that this was the best investment I had ever made. Do you think karma ends here? Ageism is a subtle but powerful form of disrespect, where experience is treated as a liability instead of an asset. This story is a powerful reminder that wisdom, experience, and a lifetime of quiet competence are a form of wealth that can't be measured on a balance sheet. Never underestimate the power of a person with a plan. Have you ever been dismissed or underestimated because of your age? Share your story of resilience in the comments below. If this story of a woman cashing in her power resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more emotional tales of justice.